Okay, in this video I'm going to try to figure out how these chord note phrases work. Okay, so let's just start a new composition. Alright, and I'll enlarge it. And I'm going to go over the phrases here. I'm using Rapid Composer 4.01. I'm going to go to phrases and pick under examples piano. I'll pick the first one and I'll make sure my cursor is on the very beginning, bar 1. Alright, and then I'll right click on Piano Basic and just hit insert. Okay, so that inserts the phrase into bar 1. That's how it sounds. Okay, now if we double click this phrase, it's going to open up the phrase editor, and you see this is the phrase in the phrase editor, so I can play it here. Okay, now what I'm going to do is select all these notes and then hit the delete key. Then I go down here and hit apply changes to phrase and composition, and what we end up with is a empty phrase container. Okay, and I'm going to save this to, I made a group called empty, meaning empty phrases, and I'm going to save it. I'm going to call it 1 bar test. Okay, and then you have to hit save selected phrases. Okay, so now if I go to empty is my folder, and I have 1 bar test. Okay, I'll close that. I'm going to delete this Piano Basic phrase, and I'm going to put my cursor back in the beginning and go to 1 bar test. Right click on that and hit insert. And now I've got an empty phrase that's 1 bar long, and I'll double click that, and that takes us to the phrase editor, and we don't see anything because it's empty. Okay, now I want to draw your attention to this information at the top. It says C major, that's our scale, and then it has number 1 major. Forget about the close, that has to do with voicing and things like that, which we can deal with later on. That's another whole subject. But if we click on this major, we can see that we have a choice of all different kinds of chords. And if we go here, we have major, major 6, the 7ths, sus chords, augmented, diminished. And if we go here, we have even more. We have all the probably about every chord you could think of. You have the 7th and the 9ths and 13ths and even others. Okay, so basically you can select any chord up here. So I'm going to select, how about a major 7th chord? Okay, and you just click on whatever chord you want. So I'll go back to major. Alright, now what I want to draw your attention to is the shading in this phrase editor. We've selected a major 1 chord, so that's CEG. That's the CEG triad in the key of C major. If we were in the key of D major, that would be D, F sharp, A, right? But we're in the key of C major, so the number 1 triad is highlighted. So you see the C here, the E, the G, and then the C. Okay, so the whatever chord you have selected up here, the notes of that chord are going to be highlighted down here in this piano grid type thing. Okay, that's the point. And to prove that, why don't we select, instead of the 1 chord in C major, let's select the 2 chord, and we'll do 2 minor because D minor. And if we look at the shading now, we see there's a shade, a light green on the D, a light green on the F, and a light green on the A. So again, the triad, the correct triad is shaded according to the chord we've chosen up here. Now the other thing you might notice, I don't know how well you can see it on this YouTube video, but the root of the chord, the green shade is slightly lighter than the 3rd of the chord and the 5th of the chord. Okay, so that kind of helps you zero in on the root of the triad, and you can see it goes up all the octaves and down all the octaves. Okay, all right. Let's try one more experiment. Let's do a 1 augmented. Okay, so do a C augmented chord, and let's look at the shading. And lo and behold, the C is shaded light, the E, and now instead of the G, the G sharp is shaded. So that definitely checks out. So the point being that whatever chord you select up here is going to determine what notes are shaded. In other words, there's a direct correspondence between the chord you select up here and the shading. And this, the purpose of this is to help you know where to place the notes on this piano grid. Okay? All right. Now, what we're going to do, let's go back to C major. What we're going to do now, we have an empty, if I go back to the composition, we have this empty phrase called 1 bar test. And, you know, there's shading in this too. And let's see what happens if we go back to the phrase editor and select one instead of major. Let's select diminished. Okay, so that changes the shading. We have C, E, and F sharp. If we go back to the composition, oh, wait a minute. I'm going to hit apply changes to phrase and composition. Okay, the shading didn't change. I thought the shading might change in this empty phrase, but it doesn't. So anyway, that's not really an issue. Okay, let's go back to major. Okay, now let's create a really, really simple phrase. Let's create a quarter note on C4. All right, and a quarter note on E4, and a quarter note on G4, and drop down to a quarter note back on C4. So we have basically a little arpeggio on a C major triad. Let's play that. I ended up giving it an interesting rhythm because I've got basically a dotted eighth note. I've got a rest here, which I didn't intend to do, but you know what? It sounds kind of nice, so let's just keep that. Okay, now you notice something, that there are numbers on these notes. It says number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 1. Now this is a really key part, a key thing to understand in Rapid Composer. These notes, if you look up here, you see note mapping, and these are chord note relative. The notes we have here are all chord note relative mapped, and there's 4 types of mapping. There's scale note, relative, chord note, bass note, and absolute note. Okay, don't worry about the other 3. Let's just focus on the chord note relative mapping. Now, if we think about a C major triad, we know it's made up of C, E, and G. And we typically will call the first note of a triad, we would call the root. In this chord note relative mapping, the first note of a chord, or if you want to call it the bass note or the root note, is designated as note number 1. Okay? All right. In music parlance, we call the next note of a triad, we call the third. And these are basically, the reason why we call it a third is because that's where it's the name of the interval. It's a third above the root. And that's why we call this the E in a C major triad the third, because it's a third above the root. But notice here in Rapid Composer, the E is not called the third. It's called the second note, because it's the second note of a major triad. Okay? So don't confuse these numbers with intervals, because they're not. They're not intervals at all. Okay? This is a mapping scheme. Okay, so the first note of a triad is designated as number 1. The second note, which is the third, we designate as number 2. And then the third note of a triad, which is the fifth, a fifth above the root, is designated as number 3. Okay? And that's how this chord mapping works. Now, if we click a note, if we select a note and right-click on it, it brings up this note mapping dialog box, and you can see it tells us that this G here, which has a number 3 on it, the note kind is chord. We know that it's a chord note relative mapping, and the note number is 3. Okay? Now, what we're going to find out is that Rapid Composer deals with more than just triads, so it has to go up to number 7. And what these numbers are basically correspond to number 1 is the root, number 2 is the third, number 3 is the fifth, number 4 is the 7th, number 5 is the 9th, number 6 is the 11th, and number 7 is the 13th. So the 7 numbers correspond to the notes of a triad and the 5 extensions above a triad. The 7th, the 9th, the 11th, the 7th, the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th. I'm sorry, number 4 would be the 7th, 5 would be the 9th, 6 would be the 11th, and 7 would be the 13th. Okay? So we have the triad, 1, 2, 3, and then the 4 upper extension notes, or the color notes, if you will. Okay? Now, don't worry about these offsets and things. This is actually pretty simple, and you'll get the hang of it I will give some explanation to it, but let's just focus on, before we get into the offsets, let's just play around a little bit with these, with this note mapping. Okay. All right, so we've got a C major triad, and I've got a number 4 up there. Let me delete that. We'll get to that later. Let me insert a G. Okay, and the G is the 3rd note of a triad, so that says number 3. Okay, we're good. Let's play that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so it's if we create a phrase with number 1, a chord note, number 1, number 2, number 3, it's going to play C, E, G, and then back to number 1, it's going to play the C. Now, if we go up here and we change this to 2, notice what happens. The shading changes, and now these notes have moved, and they're going to play a D minor triad. I'm sorry, I didn't change the 2 to minor. Let me do that. Okay, there we go. So now it's going to play a 2 minor triad. So we've got D, F, A, D. Okay, let's go to 3 minor. Okay, there we go. We've got E, G, B, E. Let's do 4. F, A, C, F. Okay, so you get the idea. Let's do 4 major. F, A. Oh, I should have said on the 4 minor it would be F, A flat, C. I didn't spot that. Okay, so, but the 4 major, F, A, C, F. Okay, so the chord, if we go back to the composition, up here in the master track, these chords that we see listed on measures 1, 2, 3, and 4, this kind of corresponds to this chord up here. In other words, this phrase, when the master track is playing it has a 5, okay? We can see what will happen to this phrase. If we go to 5, it's going to play G, B, D, G. That's how the chord is going to be played if this phrase is placed here under the 5, okay? And we can test that. We'll go to the phrase editor. Now what you've got to do here, we've got to update. Right now in the composition we've got this empty phrase, but all we have to do is go apply changes to phrase and composition, and now the phrase is filled up with what we did in the phrase editor. So if I drag this, if I control, well, I'll just drag it. If I drag this phrase to the 3rd measure, which is chord 5, we're going to see these notes change to G, B, D, G. All right? And that's exactly. Now, one thing, when you drag these phrases, you can drag them onto different notes, which are basically, you get different inversions, so that's a little tricky. But you can see here's the G and here's the phrase. Okay? So, if we go back to the phrase editor, we see that I can go back, and I'm going to go back to 1 here, that this phrase can be interpreted in as many ways as there are different chords. Okay? So each time you change the chord, the phrase will change based on the mapping. And that essentially is one of the real cornerstones of this whole software. That you have these phrases which are mapped to chords, and therefore they're, you know, they play differently. In other words, they're very flexible. You can create phrases that are going to change based on the master track. Okay, and I guess if you think about it, really, there's no difference between this and, you know, Beethoven. I mean, Beethoven would create a phrase and he'd play it in C major, and then he'd modulate to E flat minor, and, you know, he'd play the same phrase in a new scale. So basically, that's all that Rapid Composer is doing. You're taking the raw material of a basic phrase, you know, which contains rhythm and parts of a chord, maybe parts of a scale, intermixed, passing tones, whatever, and you're changing. Those phrases are going to be altered depending on the harmony. Okay, and that's you know, musicians have been doing that for a very, very long time. All right, so I'll see you in the next video. I hope this explanation is going to help you wrap your head around this whole chord note relative thing. It is a really important concept in Rapid Composer. All right, thank you.